I'm wondering about pursuing extreme flexibility. How much of this capacity is genetically and or structurally determined? For example, myself, not me, but Andrew, I've pursued these types of ranges and made very little progress. 2, how is pursuing this level of mobility, how would that fit or clash within my model? And 3, how and if this can be achieved without long-term consequences. Andrew, this is an awesome question. I'm glad you asked this. So we have to look at which type of body types are more predisposed to having extreme flexibility, because this is definitely going to be genetically and to follow along that structurally determined. For example, if you are built like an NFL lineman, there's a good chance your gymnast career is going to be short-lived. On the flip side, if you are built like a gymnast, chances are you're not going to reach elite level powerlifting status. So there is some structural biases at play. Which structure is going to be best served to pursue extreme flexibility? Well, I'm glad you asked. The structure that's going to be better at pursuing extreme flexibility has to have an eccentric bias throughout many parts of the body. If we're comparing infrasternal angle types, narrow versus wide, the narrow infrasternal angle is more of an eccentric orientation or eccentric bias. This is why if you look at elite level gymnasts, especially female gymnasts, most of them have very narrow rib cages, and a lot of times when they're doing their finish, you'll see the increased anterior to posterior dimensions. That skeletal structure innately has more flexibility than someone who has a wider infrasternal angle presentation. That doesn't mean that someone who's got a wide ISA can never be a gymnast, because sometimes you will have infrasternal angle presentations who are wide who do have a fair amount of flexibility, but they're likely not going to be as good as the person who's narrow. Let me give you an analogous example. I've known some people who are pretty good collegiate level runners who have wide infrasternal angles. But if you look at the elites, most of them have a particular body type, and that's narrow infrasternal angle, and they have a very narrow pelvis as well, because that's an efficient body structure to perform that task. Just because you have a particular structure, it doesn't mean that you can't pursue this activity, but your ceiling may not be as high as someone who's built for this. And that's just the facts of life. Some people are built to excel at activities. This is why we have things like genetic freaks at the elite level. The other thing to consider when pursuing extreme flexibility is, when did you start this process? I had this discussion with a friend of mine. She's getting into running now, and she's never been a runner. She was actually an elite level gymnast. And she says, Zach, I didn't run for 2 weeks, and I felt so out of shape. And I talked to some of my friends, and they're saying, gosh, I either could run 3 miles or 4 miles right now, no problem. And it's like, how in the heck does that happen? The issue is, when did you start developing these adaptations? Like me, for example, I grew up as a runner. I ran starting in my freshman year of high school, and I ran all the way to my senior year of college as a cross-country and track athlete. And I haven't ran in a hot minute because I hated running. The only reason I pursued running was because it was something that I was kind of good at. But I would rather be a sprinter, but I wasn't good at sprinting. But that's neither here nor there. But I would throw money down right now that I could probably, and it's been years since I've gone on a distance run, but I could run 5 miles, and my cardiovascular system wouldn't be the rate limiting step. I might get in pain because my tissues might not be used to running on pavement for 5 miles, but that's not the limiting step. And the reason why that is because I pursued those adaptations that are needed for running, eccentric cardiac hypertrophy of the left ventricle, among other things, at a young age, when my body was malleable and adaptable. Therefore, that's always something that I could probably pick up a lot faster than a person who hasn't pursued those adaptations in later in life. My friend, for example. Now, in her case, she was a very high-level gymnast. If she didn't do any flexibility training for a very long time, and she goes in and starts doing yoga or dancing or gets back into gymnastics, she would pick it up and get those eccentric adaptations that you need at the body significantly faster than someone who's starting later on in their career. So if you haven't done some of these things that require tissue adaptations or structural adaptations to be successful at an early age, your ceiling probably isn't going to be as high. This is true of a lot of things. Like, why is it easier for kids to learn new languages than it is adults? It's because they have the plasticity to do so. Why is it easier to play or learn a musical instrument when you're a kid versus an adult? Same thing. That doesn't mean it can't be done, but it's a little bit more of an uphill battle. So with that in mind, Andrew, if you don't have a structure that's predisposed to pursuing extreme flexibility, and you didn't go after those adaptations at a younger age, you have two strikes against you that will limit your ceiling of adaptation that you can get when pursuing extreme flexibility. And that doesn't mean that it can't be done, it's just you have these strikes against you. And if you don't have a body that's built for that, you don't have the tissues, the tissue adaptability is limited, that could, I'm not saying it will, but that could predispose you to being more easily succumbing to injuries, more so than if you had those adaptations. And of course we can talk about load management and things like that because that's important, but we're just talking about some of the baseline things that would make someone be successful in these endeavors versus not. So if you are that person who may not have the best structure for extreme flexibility, or you don't have those adaptations that you achieved as a kid, you just want to make sure you're pursuing this type of flexibility with an appropriate amount of load management, and you're working with the guise of someone who's well versed in this field in terms of pursuing that extreme flexibility in a safe and healthy manner. The next piece would be, how would pursuing this level of mobility fit in or clash with my model? So for me, my bias is I want the people who I'm working with to have an appropriate amount of movement options to pursue whatever it is they want to do. Extreme in flexibility or extreme in stiffness, so flexibility, gymnast, stiffness, power-based sports or strength-based sports, that is desirable to some degree to excel in those sports. But it might not be the best thing from a health perspective. And that's okay. What you have to do in that case, if you want to pursue extreme flexibility, is you just have to make sure that as you're doing that, if you're running into issues, you might need to swing back and teach yourself to create an appropriate amount of stiffness in certain areas so you hit that sweet spot of movement options. Also, too, a lot of times with people who do have extreme flexibility, they still have movement restrictions in certain directions. A common thing that I see when I'm working with people who are very flexible, and I've worked with quite a few gymnasts or dancers in my day, is they still have limitations in things like hip extension, or they still have limitations in axial skeleton measures. One thing you have to watch for if you're doing a lot of table testing with someone who is very flexible is they might have Gumby measures on the table when you're looking at the extremities. But a lot of times what will be limited is things like dynamics of the infrasternal angle, also looking at neck rotation. You can look at breathing of the rib cage and things like that, although that's a little bit less useful in my opinion. But a lot of times those measures will be limited on these people. You'll also, if the table seems squeaky clean jelly bean, many times what I'll do for those clients is I'll see how they do in standing activities and try to appreciate whether they can or cannot move well in those environments. A lot of times when you change the context, you have them perform things under load, they still falter and they lose the stack. among other things. So that might be something you need to look into when you're assessing extremely flexible people. How can this be achieved without long-term consequences? We talked about this. The appropriate thing is, or the biggest thing I should say, is load management as you're pursuing this stuff. If you don't have the structure for it, and you don't have the adaptations, you have to make sure that you're progressing in an intelligent manner and in an appropriate manner that doesn't put the tissues beyond their physiological capabilities. That's when problems and pain can ensue. And also make sure you're doing enough supportive things to the tissues, keeping your movement options open in areas that you're predisposed to being restricted. If you do that, chances are you'll be able to pursue this type of adaptations with fewer or reduction of risk of injury. And that's how I would go about working with someone who's got extreme flexibility. Key points, if I may summarize your amazing question, Andrew. First thing, it is structurally determined. Narrow ISA people have more of an eccentric bias, so they're more likely to be successful, especially if they've pursued flexibility at a younger age. Does it clash with the model? Not necessarily. We just have to make sure that extremes, if we're getting into pain or there's reductions of health and that person deems it's undesirable for them, we need to try to bring them back to the middle. And if you're going to pursue these types of things, just make sure you're managing load appropriately and you're choosing progressions that are best for you.